belongs to one and all. 'Cause these hearts, they're just made to be broken. We just don't know quite where or when. That sweet taste of love keeps us running back again. I don't wanna fall from the grace of love. And I just wanna run beneath the open sky and rise above. Oh, somebody feels the pain. Yeah, oh, they still remain. They will return in the darkest of night, grab you and hold you so tight. They'll haunt you and torture till first morning's light. Yeah, I don't wanna fall from the grace of love. And I just wanna run beneath the open sky and rise above.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. My guest today, Don Felder, was the lead guitarist for the immensely popular Eagles during their prime years. Before we get Don on the line, I want to give you some background information on him. He was born and raised in Gainesville, Florida, where his friends and musical contemporaries included artists like Stephen Stills, who he played in a band with when they were both just teenagers. Future traveling Wilbury Tom Petty, who he gave guitar lessons to, and the great Duane Allman, who he took slide guitar lessons from. After trying his luck in New York and Boston, his friend Bernie Leadon persuaded him to relocate to Los Angeles, where Bernie, Don Henley, Glenn Frey, and Randy Meisner had formed the Eagles. By then, they'd already recorded their first 2 albums in England with acclaimed engineer and producer Glenn Johns. The first one did very well, producing radio hits like Take It Easy, Peaceful Easy Feeling, and Witchy Woman, but their second album, with its solid but mellow hits, Desperado and Tequila Sunrise, was less successful. Consequently, the band decided to record their third album, On the Border, back in Los Angeles with a new producer, Bill Szymczyk, who strongly advised them to beef up the guitar element of their sound in order to compete with contemporary bands like Led Zeppelin. When he asked the band if they knew of any guitarists who might fit the bill, without hesitation, all of them answered Don Felder. They had met him backstage at one of their early Florida gigs and heard him jam with his old friend Bernie, which made quite an impression on them. They invited him to add slide guitar to their new track, A Good Day in Hell, and again were impressed to the extent that the very next day they invited him to join the band. At the time, he was playing with David Crosby and Graham Nash, ironically covering all the guitar and vocal parts of his old friend Stephen Stills, who had left them to pursue a solo career. Taking Graham Nash's advice, he decided to accept the offer to join the Eagles and went on to become a major contributor to the band as both a guitarist and a songwriter. On the Border and its follow-up One of These Nights proved to be huge sellers, yet still paled in comparison to the Greatest Hits compilation which followed them. With 29 million domestic sales, plus an additional 13 million internationally, the Eagles' Greatest Hits has chalked up an astonishing 42 million units sold. Feeling that they had strayed too far from their country roots, Bernie Leadon left the band and was replaced by Joe Walsh. Though the band was based in and widely associated with California, ironically none of the band members were actually from there. Don Henley was from Texas, Glenn Frey was from Michigan, Randy Meisner was from Nebraska, and Don Felder was from Florida. That common experience of driving into Los Angeles on Route 66, with the city representing all their hopes and dreams, inspired the Hotel California concept, which they could all relate to and write songs about. The music for the title track was written by Don Felder, and the lyrics were written by Don Henley with some minor input from Glenn Frey. The album was another big commercial success, but it ultimately proved too much for the band to handle, so after releasing one last album in the long run, they disbanded. In 1983, Don released a solo album called Airborne. A track from the album called Never Surrender appeared on the Fast Times at Ridgemont High soundtrack. He had even greater solo success with the song Heavy Metal from the animated film of the same name. Then in the mid-1990s, the Eagles reunited for their Hell Freezes Over album and tour, but problems soon arose as certain band members started putting money and business ahead of music and friendship. For example, on the liner notes for Hell Freezes Over, Henley and Frey changed the songwriting credits for Hotel California, inflating their roles in its writing while diminishing Don Felder's. Refusing to be bullied, he stood his ground, resulting in legal battles and ultimately his departure from the band. Around that same time, his marriage of nearly 30 years ended in divorce, and his reflections on his loss of both personal and professional identity eventually evolved into a full-fledged autobiography, 2008's best-selling Heaven and Hell, My Life in the Eagles, 1974 to 2001. Revisiting all the key events of his life inspired him to write corresponding songs that became the basis of his new album, Road to Forever. Joining me on the phone from Los Angeles, California, is Don Felder. Welcome.
Hey, I'm glad to be on the phone with you, Dan.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your book, and if you don't mind, I'd like to take you back to some of the childhood experiences that I think really contributed to your desire to become a musician. The first pertains to your health. I know as a young boy you were hospitalized for a long period of time, turning quite literally to music for comfort. What can you tell us about that bout with polio?
Yeah, it was unusual. I have some very specific recollections about that time. I remembered I wasn't feeling well at all, and my mother couldn't figure out if I had the flu or what was going on. So she took me to the doctors, and they diagnosed that I had a very early case of polio. And in those days, they had children's polio wards where you were isolated from the rest of the hospital because they weren't certain how contagious it was. And so I remember being in this children's polio ward for almost an entire summer, and kids were being taken in and out of the ward and eventually placed as their disease worsened into iron lungs, which would help them breathe. Yes. And my escape from that particular environment was the only entertainment they had was they had these round, flat speakers that were metal, and you could put them under your pillow or by your pillow, and you could listen to the radio station. So there was no television or cartoons or anything like that in those days, so I spent almost nonstop time listening to the radio. Whatever was on the radio, it was my escape. I could close my eyes and just fly out of that polio ward and not see what I was looking at as far as the potential future of what was going to happen to me. So,
and you were, 4 or 5 years old?
Yeah, I was right at 5 years old, yeah.
And the Salk vaccine kind of came along at a good time for you.
It was a lifesaver for me. I still have some physical remnants of that early affliction. I have my feet have kind of drawn up a little bit. People say it looks like a really extremely high arch, but it's the first stages of polio when your feet start curling up. And I was just very, very blessed and fortunate to have been there in that situation at the same time the Salk vaccine came out, and I got it just in time to kind of ward off the worst part of that disease.
Yeah. Well, another formative experience was having an older brother who was such a good student and such a good athlete and cast such a massive shadow that he seemed like an impossible act to follow until you discovered you had an ability with music that he couldn't equal, and your musical ability also earned approval from a hard-to-please father. So do you think if you'd been an only child or had a different type of father, you might have been less driven to develop your musical talent?
That's a really difficult question to answer in that all I know growing up is that the one thing that made my father really happy was listening to music. And so in an effort psychologically to please my father, I wanted to see that satisfaction on his face coming from me playing music. And unfortunately, he never lived long enough to really be able to see my success in the Eagles. Shortly after I joined the Eagles, he passed away, and never really got to see my success, and which is kind of sad for me and him. I think he would have been more than delighted to have seen my success and very proud of me.
There's a funny story in your book involving a situation where you and your friend Bernie Ledden were sitting in a restaurant. Your girlfriends showed up and saw these two beautiful heads of hair from behind sitting across from you guys. Of course, they assume the worst. Your girlfriend runs out crying. His storms over to confront you guys. Who were the two girls you were sitting with?
Well, they weren't girls. It was Dwayne and Greg Allman, who had really long blonde hair. And when we finished playing over on Daytona Beach, when we finished our set, we would go to this diner at 1 or 2 in the morning whenever we got done, and we'd sit and eat scrambled eggs or breakfast and tell stories and, shoot the bull. And so they were sitting with their back to the door, and my girlfriend, who had driven over to try to find me, thought for certain I was seeing another girl, came barging in there, saw this long blonde hair, turned around and steamed out of the diner in a huff, and Bernie's girlfriend came over to bawl us out because she thought we were both cheating on them with other women, and it was two guys sitting there, so it was quite a hilarious moment.
Especially because we all know what Greg and Dwayne Allman look like, so you can really picture it in your mind. And the early days of long hair. I laughed out loud when I read that. I read it over again like 4 or 5 or 6 times in a row. Laughed every time.
Yeah.
Well, getting back to your musical development, I wanted to talk about a band you were in called Flow, because I think their approach to music really benefited you down the road in terms of songwriting and improvisational skills. What did you gain musically from being in that band?
Well, I gained a great deal. That band was set up as a jazz fusion rock band. We would have song ideas, and we would write lyrics and songs. But in the middle of these songs, we would take free-form solos. One of the guys in the band was a guy named John Winter, a great alto sax player, not like Kenny G, but his phrasing was just marvelous. So I really learned a lot of my musical phrasing approach from the way he played sax. My father liked horn bands as well, so all the music that was played in my house as a kid were all like Benny Goodman and a lot of the horn bands. And so I absorbed a lot of that early phrasing from horn bands and from working with John Winter and Flo. And the improvisational skills I developed when you're just thrown out on the stage and you've got to make up a solo, and it can't be the same solo you played 25 times. It's just free form. It's much like jazz players do, and I have the highest respect for their ability to improvise and just reach up into the air and grab genius and let it come out of their instruments. And so we had a great deal of respect for that, and that's what we wanted to develop in that band. And so later in life, those skills of being able to improvise came in really handy when I was making records, because I could just make up a solo or make up a part that went in a certain song, and it really it benefited me greatly over the years in my career to have developed improvisational skills.
Well, that band was actually signed by no less than Creed Taylor and did record an album. But when it became apparent that it wasn't going to work out, you told Creed you were moving to Boston, which brings up another funny story. He told you he'd call up a friend at Berklee College of Music to see if he could, quote, get you in. What did you think he meant by that?
Well, I wasn't sure, and when I got there, I went to see this guy, and they offered me a job teaching there.
Right.
And I had been a guitar teacher in the past back in Gainesville, and I just really didn't want to teach guitar. I wanted to get in a studio and learn how to make records, write, produce, arrange, engineer, mix, every aspect of record production. I wanted to absorb myself in and just soak that up for a couple of years. And so I called Creed, and he actually called a couple of studios there and opened a few doors for me to be able to start working in some studios.
Well, it's funny because the way the story came across in the book, it was like when he said, let me see if I can get you in, you thought he meant as a student, but he meant as a teacher.
That's right.
Yeah. I'll see if I can get you in. You're like, Creed, I don't want to take any more lessons. I need to make money.
That's right.
Now, if Creed Taylor thought you were qualified to teach at Berklee, that's high praise.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I was flabbergasted when I got there. They offered me a job teaching as opposed to a student. But I had, like I said, I was self-taught. I'd learned to read music on my own. I listened to jazz records, and I'd learned them by ear before I learned to read and write music. And so I had developed a good musical sense about what the instrument was. I could hear somebody play something once or twice and play it because I knew where they were playing and what key and in what position on the guitar, and be able to pretty much spit it right back at them. So it was nothing that I wasn't used to, but I just really never felt that I was qualified to teach at Berklee College of Music. That I thought when he meant that I was going to be a student there, and I really wasn't what I wanted to do.
Well, he's a guy, he was an impresario, whatever the word is. He knew music, and he thought highly of your playing. Well, before we got you on the line, I explained to our listeners all the circumstances that led you to the Eagles. So I want to go ahead and talk about one of their well-known songs and have you explain to us the nature of the arrangement before and after your contribution to it, the song being One of These Nights.
Okay, Glenn had started banging away on this piano with some of those chords, and he and Don were starting to write this song, which became One of These Nights. And quite frequently we'd have a sketchy framework at best when we went into the studio of a song idea, and it would come together in the studio. We were actually recording in Miami, and Randy Meisner, who was the bass player at the time, lived in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, and he was unable to join us in the studio when we were working up that track. He got snowed in Scottsbluff. So I decided, well, I can play bass. I'll play bass, and we'll kind of run through the parts, and everybody can figure out how it's going to work. And so Bernie played guitar. I played bass. I wrote the opening bass part to it. As a matter of fact, I wrote the whole bass part on the record. And then the next day, Randy flew in, and I had to sit down and show him the bass part that I had written for that song. And then later, I got to actually play electric guitar on the record and do some of the harmony stuff, the rhythm stuff, and the solo on it, kind of build the overdubs on top of the basic track that I had written as far as the bass part, too. So,
well, the reason I ask is that song kind of represents to me, if you think of the Eagles before and after Don Felder, that's definitely an after.
Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and listen to that, and we'll focus on the intro that you wrote, your bass line, your guitar parts, your guitar fills during the verses, and, of course, that classic solo.